Hey, welcome to our stream. This is a conversation about the art of Destiny. I have three artists from Bungie here on our panel today. So yes, there are times when we're up on our Twitch channel and we are looking forward to new content. Today we're going to look back across the creative process that has brought the world of Destiny to life and explore some of the seeds that were planted and see some of the art that influenced years of hard work in bringing that world to life. So let me introduce you to my panel. I have Jesse Van Dyke.
Hey Deej, how's it going?
Good morning, good to see you. I have Joseph Cross.
Deej.
Glad to have you here.
Happy to be here.
All right, and we have Adrian Myshak. So let's get into it, shall we?
Sure.
Who has the magic clicker? You do.
There we go, I have a clicker. So what I'd like to do today is talk about a number of specific things that were in the game that people are familiar with. What we always try to infuse into the world we build is a sense of idealized reality. We like to look at things that excite us, things that we either see in the real world or in entertainment or in other media, or things that that generally inspire us. Sort of break down what it is that we believe makes those things exciting, and then really try to dial that up to 11 when we put it back into the game. What we want to accomplish ultimately is a world that feels hopeful, that you want to spend time in, but. When you think about the premise of Destiny, it is a post-apocalyptic world. There's a great number of ways in which you can build worlds like that are not at all hopeful or that are not at all inviting. And so it takes a decent amount of iteration for us to sort of hit the thematic nail on the head, so to speak. And that happens through conversation. It happens through collaboration, It's worth pointing out that before we ended up with images like the one you see here, we spent a significant amount of time trying to really get to that sweet spot. What do we feel really captures that sense of idealized reality? And I'll run you through some of the examples of that right now. This is one of the shots that Dorje Belbrook did that was hugely important in the conversation about what we wanted Mars to feel like, for example. In many ways, that actually is a great example of some of the things that I touch upon. It is a post-apocalyptic premise, but it is designed to make you want to explore, right? Another great example of that is a very early shot for Venus that Jamie Jones did. Mythic science fiction. It is the fusion, effectively, of some of the themes that you associate more with classical classical backdrops like fantasy settings, coupled with something that could, hypothetically exist on some other planet out there in space. The flowers, an example for in the foreground, are a great example of an addition that we decided on when we looked at this image. We might have felt like it was too gloomy initially. Why don't we offset that with something that people don't typically associate with sort of the lion's den, the lair of some malignant god? Why would there be flowers? That's actually a juxtaposition that we feel sort of thematically is interesting. The job we do ultimately is not specifically about creating the imagery alone. Obviously it is a hugely important component of our work to create those images, but ultimately what they represent, the ideas that are captured in those images, is why we're here. And those ideas are not formed in isolation in the concept pod, certainly not. Those are the result of all of these people in the studio. You see a small portion of our main production floor here. This is another shot of it. All of these people ultimately have some stake in what goes into these images, the worlds that we create.
So take us deeper into this regression. What are some of the things that you'd like to show us
Yeah,
today?
so what I'd like to talk about next is a great example of something that was an idea that we started talking about way early on, long before we shipped D1 and or Destiny, as we call that D1 for clarity's sake, and ended up making a return in the Taken King in sort of an unexpected way. And this is the thing that I'd like to talk about is the colony ship. So people that have played the game, been to Cosmodrome, are familiar with sort of the landmark that you see in the sky. Those are the colony ships. The narrative there is that those were the ships that originally took human and civilization to the stars. These were the ferries essentially that took people off the planet.
So the traveler arrives in our system, gifts us with amazing technology, touches off a new space race, only instead of competing with the Russians, we're actually coming to, I guess it's inspired by Baikonur, right? It's inspired by the
absolutely.
Russian spaceports,
Yeah.
where they launch their own cosmonauts into space. And I mean, that was fascinating to me as a a child of the 80s and the Cold War and all that stuff, to be able to go to old Russia and see, their old commitment to space exploration embodied by, this future glimpse was really cool personally for me.
Yeah, and so it's interesting, because all of the things you just mentioned need to be represented by what it is that players see ultimately. And while that doesn't need to be super explicit, it needs to be clear, it needs to have a memorable shape. And so if you take a look at what it looked like when we first started developing this particular locale, it was very different. It was, technically speaking, very much the same thing as what's currently in the game. It was a big spaceship. It was sitting there. It's had been sitting there for centuries, in fact.
Maybe too relatable, though. I mean, I see a space shuttle there.
Well, there's that, and it's also if you squint your eyes, actually, it's a valid question to ask yourself what actually is different about that one shape in the distance compared to the launch tower, for example, and that was a problem.
Yeah.
So this is a great example of how the concept team typically works. What we do is we take a screenshot of this. We spend 5 minutes doing a very rough, napkin sketch, as we call it, on top of an image like this, and basically send an image like this around and saying, well, instead of doing that, what if we did this? When we do an image like that, we then proceed on to say, well, what if we clarified it a little bit more? What if we had this idea of, multiple engines being there, multiple ships? Isn't that a much clearer way of saying, humanity's technology has advanced beyond a certain point at this point, because look, they're clearly capable of not carrying just one space shuttle up in space. They're actually capable of carrying many at the same time. Now, if you start to think about sort of the technicalities of that, it's completely implausible. I'll immediately admit that. But the spirit of the idea was something that resonated with us. And
Science fiction.
With a very large emphasis on the fiction, exactly. Yeah. So what we then started to try to do is okay, well, what if we make this slightly less ridiculous, but retain some of the qualities that are memorable about it? And what happens next is you go through a process where we start testing this thing out. So we reduce the amount of shuttles. We think a little bit more clearly about, well, how would the engine work? But ultimately that leads to a point where we have a design that's then fleshed out, and then we that's what ended up in the game. In this particular case, though, we spent a great deal of thought thinking about, all of these intricacies that might not be immediately apparent. And so what ended up happening was, this ship ultimately became the second mission of the Taken King campaign, where players now actually go inside of the ship and sort of get to find out a little bit more detail about the story you alluded to about the colonists.
With the level of detail that you apply to your work, you can sort of daydream years into the future. You guys have concept art for things that we haven't even touched on yet, and that's one of the really cool things about sort of knowing you guys and being able to sort of take the long way to a meeting, is to walk past people's desks and see what they're sketching, and obviously you're creating things that may never see the light of day, but if it informs our process of helping us to imagine this world from every different angle, it's really valuable to how we create. The other thing that really strikes me as interesting about the work that you do in concepting the game is that, I've followed a lot of film production and sci-fi films and stuff like that. I've seen all the old Art of Star Wars books, and I always thought of a concept artist as somebody who works sort of isolated to pre-production, sketching out things, realizing the characters. We've any hardcore Star Wars fan has seen early sketches of Darth Vader, and we thought he'd need a breather to move from ship to ship, but what if that breather was a permanent fixture of his persona, And then later on, people are getting into making the armor, and the concept art is just sort of left back in the past where they began. But when I see those paint-overs, and when I see you taking the game in progress and screenshotting it and drawing more on top of it, it's interesting to see how you're concepting Destiny throughout every phase of development. You're working hand in hand with the world artists and saying, good start, what if we added this or what if we added that?
Yep.
Which really kind of changes the way I personally think about concept art as part of a creative team.
Concept art for game development is a much more collaborative process in that respect, and that's just true.
Yeah.
And that's what's exciting about it.
Yeah.
I think in film, concept does tend to get left in the pre-production.
Sure.
And then move on.
Well, if they're building a science fiction set and somebody's on set going, "Hey, I drew a different ship," get out of here.
Exactly.
Get out of here. So, what's next?
So another thing that was part of the Taken King was a weapon called the Sleeper Simulant. It was an exotic weapon. Was always designed to be an exotic weapon, and we started off by thinking of this weapon as part of the suite of hardware that we started introducing to players with some of the Rasputin flavored spaces. Mm-hmm. And what you see here is one of the original concepts for that, which was like designed as a prop, but it in some ways set sort of the tone for that particular aesthetic. Here's a great example of a concept that Dorje Belbrook did for the space that I mentioned.
Golden Age technology. It ain't pretty, but it looks super functional.
Exactly.
It's kit bashed together by people who are rushing to use new technology to create amazing things.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, sort of consumer friendliness is not these guys' concern. Like it needs to perform, and it is all at sort of the cutting edge of technology. Really, like it's experimental in many ways. We went back to look at what were some of our inspirations for that original design, and there were things varying from like satellites to things like the Mars rover to
the Nighthawk.
Things that at one point were that looked like they were very experimental and like sort of cutting edge technology. The
things that would have been easily science fiction 20 years ago.
Yes, exactly. And in some ways, the look of the earlier stealth planes, sort of purely aesthetically speaking, are much more interesting than the modern ones because they look nothing like what planes were thought of prior to people seeing this ship. The first thing we do is we start putting that together, and we make various proposals here. And like I said, for the Sleeper Simulant, one of the most important things was that it needed to feel like a prototypical weapon. So it needed to look like a group of scientists was still working on it, was still trying to figure out what the optimal configuration of some of these subcomponents was. So that's why, for example, there's alligator clamps on there and like these little tie wraps. And that ended up, that then ends up as a concept proposal. But the development of the weapon doesn't stop there. What happened next in this particular case was that we handed off the concept to the 3D hard surface team and sort of explained some of the philosophies behind it. And they ran with it.
That's an interesting point you make about the hard 3D surface team. It's that your concept art is not prescriptive. This isn't a recipe, go make this. It's like, here's a vision of what an experimental technology based on Serif Tech would look like. They go and they say, okay, yeah, interesting ideas here, and they're able to go and also be creative and to also create in their own way.
And like the thing is, like if there's one certainty you'll have is that whatever you end up with as a final image as a concept artist is never what it's going to look like in game, because there's always going to be an increased insight into what the actual requirements are. Like you haven't really fully experienced the quality of your idea until you actually play it with a controller in hand and to see, okay, so this is actually what that looks like.
Up next, Joseph Cross. You're going to take us through a regression of some things like the graphic design and some of the heroes that we know in this universe.
Yes, that's true. I'll start with graphic design. One of the first images I saw when I first got here, and one of the most inspiring images, and I think probably one of the best sort of images that's for a visual metaphor for the art of our game.
Yeah.
This encompasses a lot of things.
The terminology is so raw when you're early in post-production. I mean, a fan would look at that and say, that's glimmer and that's a pulse rifle. That's a bullpup pulse rifle, but it's like when you're sort of in the raw space, you're thinking about dungeons, you're thinking about treasure, you're thinking about near future, futuristic weapons, blending science fiction with fantasy. It's actually fun for me personally to hear some of the more archaic, broad brush strokes that you would use to describe this art, because the more you're sort of free to imagine in a specific direction, the less encumbered you're going to be about arriving at a cool place that we can all iterate on.
I try to create buckets of directions to think about, to not to stay, too closely to, but just to inform decision making, which is the bold Swiss modern minimal style heraldic, ornate, and sacred geometry, which sacred geometry I think about warlocks and the speaker and the traveler and sort of the mysterious alchemy and math that we don't quite understand yet, and I leverage that for things like the Cryptarch logo and stuff like that. Here's a sheet of some brands in our game that I created.
For me, in playing through the game, this stuff actually did fascinate me because it told me certain things about the human society that we were digging back into. In the tower, we have factions, we have weapons manufacturers, but to think about sort of the spacefaring exploration phase, of our backstory, the Golden Age, rushing back out to the stars to, colonize these newfound worlds that we could finally reach. There was a commercial aspect to that. You have a Russian space agency. You have a corporation that was headquartered in the, buried city on Mars. And to think about the fact that humanity was enhanced, humanity was enlightened by the magic of the traveler, but we still had, corporations, we still had office buildings, we still had organizations that were helping and aiding in this exploration.
Yeah, and I also paid attention to the brand, the Destiny brand as a whole. Very conscious the whole time that while I'm creating all these disparate brands and identities and sigils and crests, I still wanted to feel like that when you looked at a sheet like this, where we've got a dozen or so examples, there was a cohesiveness and a unity that I felt like could represent.
Sure. Well, this becomes player branding. There are players who define themselves by the emblems that they wear in our game.
Then we'll get quickly to the class icons. These are some of the most intimidating designs for me that I did for the game, just because I know that they would have the most impact, and were also most likely to be tattoos.
Yeah, I can guarantee that these are tattoos. I've seen the tweets.
Yeah. So it's the first time I folded in the potential tattooing into my sort of line.
That would make a great tattoo.
Yeah.
So that was part of your design process?
Yeah.
Like, make sure that this would be good
Exactly.
as a tattoo. Like, I can't make that tattoo.
Yeah.
That's way too detailed.
I wanted to minimize the amount of regret people had. Here's an example of some iteration process that the Warlock sigil or icon went through. You can see very primitive shapes. It's just triangles. The one that ended up, it's 3 triangles with an outline, and that stuck. It was a great example of something that's difficult to let go of. Like, it's hard to know that, okay, that's the one.
Yeah, sure.
But at a certain point, that's the beauty of being a production artist, is that time runs out. I'm going to jump in now to the Suros Foundry, which I did a bunch of work on for Taken King. We'll start off with Adrian's concept of the original Suros regime, or what it was originally the Arcus regime. The first thought is less is more. When you think about design cycles of industrial design, often it's about stripping away and reducing the amount of detail. And we like to think of the Suros brand as the Formula One of weapon manufacturers. So this is an obvious influence for me. I'm a big fan of Formula One. I love the industrial design of these things. More inspiring images. I also pulled images from Braun, the great Dieter Rams is a legendary industrial designer.
Yeah.
I feel like this is one of the coolest coffee makers I've seen. Definitely the coolest coffee maker I've seen. And then lastly, I'm going to talk for a minute about Eris Morn, a character I concepted and designed, who's one of my favorites, one of the most rewarding experiences I've had working on characters, at least. I've always loved this costume design from this white ninja from a film called Samurai Spy, which is an amazing film. And then I started thinking about her story, and another unusual example where in concept I got to actually create her backstory, which made it through for the most part. Infiltrating the hive, assassinating a hive prince, but basically having to live with the hive for a long period of time to get close to them, to understand them, because she's a master assassin. And this image inspired me. Like, I think about Eris in the hive ship, walking with the hive, behaving like them. So maybe she can walk with them, they don't even notice her. She sort of went crazy while she was down there. She actually developed sort of an affection for the hive.
An obsession.
A Stockholm syndrome, an obsession, like a sympathy for them.
Yeah, definitely tells the story about her becoming corrupted by the darkness, or just like those characters in The Walking Dead that you served up as resource material. You know, they make a conscious choice to drape themselves in the zombie guts so that they can walk among the enemy undetected. She takes that a step further, actually altering her physiology or becoming altered just by, you know, unwillingly by the environment so that she can survive and that, you know, she can escape, essentially.
She's not ashamed of it. She loves her black ooze.
That's a badge of honor.
Yeah. So that's all I got. I'll hand it over to Adrian.
All right. Adrian, now on the hot seat. Thank you so much, Joseph. That stuff was cool.
Thank you.
And Adrian, what are you going to show us?
I'm going to talk a little bit about the concepts I did for the Taken King. I'm going to start with the Dreadnaught. I saw this and it's like something I hadn't really seen before.
This was a postcard, right? We create these postcard images to essentially try to encapsulate everything, like the mood and the setting and the basic design elements for all of the different destinations in the game.
Exactly. Okay. This is another piece of art done by Dorje Belbrook, who's probably feeling his ears burn right now.
Yeah, Dorje's got a lot of early visions of the game.
But what really drew me to this was just this ghost ship. I mean, he's even got barnacles on this thing, just like floating through space, and that's obviously Saturn back there. So this thing's entering our solar system. We did what Jesse had referred to as a napkin sketch. It's mostly digital napkins these days.
Yeah. But, Wacom tablets have replaced the cocktail napkin in our modern society.
So I was kind of over at his desk and we were talking about the shape. We wanted a very simple monolithic shape, this giant tomb floating through space. And from there, I did this cutaway showing like, all right, this is how huge the ship is. This shot that Dorje had shown before, that's how big it actually is. You can imagine.
And this just gives us a sense of just the sheer enormity. I mean, it looked like a long ship in the original view that we saw, but that was just like all the way in the back fifth of the ship, just looking back out across the tail.
Taking those same style cues and scaling it down.
Yeah, their entire fleet definitely does operate on a given theme.
Another thing I did quite a bit on the Taken King was environment paintovers. We were talking about collaboration, where we work pretty heavily with the level design teams. So we'll take all the hard work that they've already done, blocking out these spaces, and what's that like extra 10% we can layer on top of it. So I'll take something, a screenshot like this, and start layering effects, atmosphere, floating player ships. So taking a screenshot like this and really giving it a focal point, giving it a big, glowing light to go if they get lost. Taking this level, which was already like a nice block out, but we really want to show off our Skybox team does such amazing work. Why not like open this up, give you a sense of where you are, and just something to gawk at after you're done killing the hive. This is an earlier concept I had done of the one of the Cabal ships crashed into the side of the Dreadnought that ended up getting fleshed out into this. I also did a lot of work on Oryx himself, especially the raid version. So this was the original design from him, done by another one of our concept artists. Took it upon myself to create this sequence of him standing here. You walk into this dark room, you see a little bit of highlights and some strange sounds or breathing, and then this backdrop starts to tear away, kind of pulling into him and revealing Saturn behind him, kind of like this operatic moment. And it actually ended up making it pretty closely in. Instead of his wings, it's kind of like the darkness pulling in.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting how the visions are so compelling. The source art that you create is so compelling, but then when it ends up in the final product, instead of drawing in fabric as if it's wings, he is sort of like the darkness is coalescing around him. So it supports all of those story themes that are prevalent throughout Destiny, light versus dark and those sorts of things.
This is the raid version of Oryx. Obviously, he's much bigger than your original encounter, and realized this design was probably successful enough when one of our 3D artists sent me these images back.
I love this. Yeah.
So
yeah, So just like Joseph wants his design to be good enough to be on a tattoo, your design is complete when it's worthy of being on a van parked outside of a heavy metal concert.
Exactly. Van worthy is like the biggest thumbs up.
Van worthy.
I also worked on a sequence for his death when you finally take out Oryx in the raid. He kind of crystallizes and floats towards Saturn. So a lot of these effects passes just to kind of flesh out that final 10% of the game.
Yep.
Taking pieces from your trophy kill. You can see the Titan has his wings basically ripped off.
Why don't you take us home here?
To the Gallarhorn, which a lot of people are probably familiar with.
A few people are familiar with the Gallarhorn. Yeah.
This is one of those things that, not just seeing it in the game, but this weapon apparently resonated with a lot of people because I've seen it done by prop makers and made into a t-shirt cannon.
T-shirt cannons right here in our
things.
studio, absolutely. I mean, it was definitely one of the phenomenons of Destiny Year 1. So we will go back into Destiny Year 1 and exhume the Gallarhorn and visit our old Wolfpack round launching friend. Classical elements, heraldic knights,
Exactly.
ornamental armor pieces.
Pulling into some of the stuff that Joe had talked about earlier as well. And the next step was to take that, cool, we have that in some of the armor now, but let's make a weapon out of it.
Yep. Every knight needs their Excalibur, and check that out. Like, how many wolves did the Gallarhorn have on it? Like 14 wolves or something like that? Anyway, we had so much fun with this, and I think it's obvious that when the Sandbox design team went through and started imbuing these artistic concepts with perks and attributes, the Gallarhorn was loved by many because it was the most powerful gun in the game. But I think it's obvious why we, gave this gun so much power is because it's so inspiring. One of the interesting things to watch while chat is scrolling while you're talking about the Gallarhorn. It was such a polarizing element for fans in Destiny Year 1. There was some people in chat that were saying, it was like Excalibur, swoon. The reaction videos of people finally acquiring this weapon, and it was sort of like completed the adventure for so many characters. And then there were other people in our chat saying, essentially, like, they didn't like the elitism that went with the weapon because it was this thing where if you didn't have it, you were somehow incomplete. But this is the passion that you guys are able to inspire with your work. So.
On that note, actually, I would like to point out that I think it's usually unfair that we as employees don't get these things just handed to us in our postmaster slot.
Nope.
It's terrible.
You make it yourself, and then you have to wait for Xur to sell it to you.
Yeah.
I'm going to do a very poor job of actually saying the names of the people who are asking these questions, so I'm just going to ask them. One person had an interesting curiosity. We've shown all of those desks, and we've shown the fact that you guys do work in very specific elements. How do we lead this process? Who at Bungie, or what groups of people at Bungie, help take all of these creative elements and make sure that they get into a game?
Well, I think that one of the things we value very much is the idea that, ultimately, Bungie is a creative meritocracy. We want there to be an atmosphere where sort of the best idea gets implemented, right?
Yeah.
And it ultimately doesn't really matter who comes up with that idea.
Can't argue with that.
Yeah.
Adrian, we're going to let you have the last word. What's been the most impactful or rewarding or inspiring reaction that the community's had to the things that you've created, and how has that changed the way you think about your work?
Well, it's hard to think about, but the most recent example I can think of is walking around Comic-Con last month and seeing all these designs that everybody on the team has been a part of, and just walking around like we had an Eris walking around.
We had a young lady carrying a perfect replica of the Suros regime. That was one of the fun things about our panel discussion at Comic-Con, is we had that row right down the center of the chairs, and we had cosplayers who were wearing the very things that we were talking about. And when we would get to those slides, we'd invite them to actually stand up and sort of walk the catwalk with the things that they created. So. Yeah, as somebody who has worked with a lot of theater companies in the past, to see our players actually become actors, and sort of embrace every day being Halloween, and to take the art you create and to adorn themselves in that stuff and walk around in the real world. I mean, that's got to blow your mind.
Well, it's so much work to put those things together, so they're getting excited about it, and that's really fun to see. And a lot of times we're working within the vacuum of the studio, so like seeing the impact that has outside of it is really cool.
That is very cool. Well, gentlemen, I appreciate you sitting in the hot seat today, sharing with us a little bit of your creative process and a little bit of yourselves. One more time, Jesse Van Dyke, Joseph Cross, Adrian Myshak. These are the artists who have created the visions that have shaped the development of Destiny. I'm Deej. It's been my pleasure to host you today. This has been a fun conversation. We thank you for playing Destiny, and more importantly, we thank you for the ways that you take this game and turn it into culture. It changes the way these guys think about the work they do, and changes the game.